Hey everybody, welcome to Tech Tickle. Just thought I'd stop in today and give you my thoughts on the Ryzen release today and all the benchmarks that have come out. Of course, I don't have my own sample yet because I'm just a small little piddly shit channel. I ain't got access to nothing, but I figured I would go over all of the data and interpret it for you in a TLDR fashion. So, let's get to it. Step 1, let's go over the different areas, different venues that these CPUs are going to be used in and talk about how you can expect them to perform based on the agglomeration of data that I have collected today from various different reviewers, and credit all goes to them, of course. We'll start with content creation, which is the most relevant topic to me. It's what I was most interested in, I think, when this product line was launched and being developed and being leaked and being teased, and it's a big win for AMD, there's no denying that. Going head-to-head with the 6900K in virtually every test and beating it in many, and providing a great value at half the price or less, depending on whether or not you feel like overclocking the smaller bin. So, not much to discuss there. We all knew that would be the case going in. No surprises. So in terms of gaming, kind of a mixed bag. There's no doubt about that. It would seem that at 1440p and 4K in a lot of AAA titles, there's virtually no difference between this and anything else. But that's because those scenarios are not really big frame-pushing scenarios. So when you apply games like CSGO or Overwatch to the scenario, and you do it at 1080p when you're pushing frame rates up into the 2, 3, 400s, you see a huge difference there. Obviously, KB Lake is going to be a lot more capable of pushing out frames there, and this has people disappointed, I think. Even when you go for some AAA titles that don't necessarily go as high, you're still seeing a bit of a deficiency, anywhere from 10 to 15%. But what's really odd is that in some games, despite the fact that in a lot of scenarios, the Broadwell IPC match that fucking Ryzen was supposed to be having is indeed there, but in some benchmarks, in some games like Ashes of the Singularity, you're seeing this major disparity between the 6900K and the 1800X, and it's inexplicable. You're talking same number of cores, generally the same IPC, and this is demonstrable in other formats, but for some reason in games is being held back. Now, I've heard a lot of theories as to why. I've heard that there are pending Windows 10 updates coming. I've heard that there are microcode updates pending that might correct the issue. There definitely were a lot of bumps in terms of what reviewers were experiencing. I've spoken to a few of them today, and I said, hey, I heard your motherboard was kind of giving you problems and you had to have it replaced. So I heard that you may have gotten a bad sample. I've heard that you had problems overclocking. I heard that you had issues with limitations with the memory. Some of them couldn't even get them past 2400. A whole bunch of things, maybe related to this, maybe not, were encountered during a review that may have sort of skewed the results. But it's weird. It's just kind of odd. Like, I expect this to be on par with an 8-core Intel CPU in terms of gaming performance, which would make perfect sense if indeed the IPC is the same and the clocks have been normalized to match. But the fact that it is really so far behind in some scenarios, mostly gaming scenarios, is a bit of a question mark. I don't have any thoughts as to why. We will see if it is a firmware microcode software issue that can be revised later in coming weeks, and I'm sure somebody will tear it apart and give us a better idea. But for now, yes, there is a definite gaming deficiency. But I will stress, overall for gaming, when this CPU is paired with a 1070 or a 1080 and at resolutions of 1080p in some cases, but especially 1440p or higher, there isn't a difference. So the question is this: do you think that that existing CPU limitation, which seems to be single-threaded in orientation, probably, if you think that is going to be a significant limiting factor going forward, then obviously Ryzen's not a good 2 or 3 year investment. But if you think multi-thread optimization is going to expand, it is going to broaden, and that developers will eventually leverage all those additional cores and will find a way to move away from that single-threaded requirement, then maybe Ryzen's not so bad going forward. It's impossible to say at this point. I'm not even going to speculate. Next up, overclocking. Okay, so this is where we kind of figured we'd be disappointed based on what the engineering samples were doing out there in the wild. And what they were reporting seems to be what we're seeing today. And that is this. There's a good and a bad. There's general shit overclocking with the top end. So the 1800X is not something that you're buying because it has higher potential overclocks. You're buying the 1800X and the 1700X because they have higher guaranteed performance but what seems like the same performance ceiling in terms of overclocking. So far, the majority of samples that I have seen, either firsthand, secondhand, through friends in the industry here in Toronto, that may or may not have contacts at the AMD offices up in Markham, and from reviewers we're seeing across the internet, it would seem that the average overclock across all 8 cores that people are able to attain is anywhere from 3.9 gigahertz up to 4.1 if you're willing to go over 1.4 to 1.45 volts, which even AMD doesn't really recommend you do because it will reduce the longevity of your CPU. But that seems to be the range. Now, that is disappointing because Broadwell E usually is good for a solid 4.2, 4.3 or higher, and there are many that will go as high as 4.5, no problem. So there's a definite deficiency there as well, although not as exaggerated as the one that has apparently reared its head in terms of gaming and CPU limitation there. The good news is, and I already alluded to this earlier, is that the 1700, the low bin here, the 3.0, 3.7 chip, appears to overclock just as well as both the 1700X and the 1800X. No variation in maximum OC. And that would be the case if you believe that the engineering samples that were floating about prior to release were indeed representative of what was seen at retail. So it seems like the binning process at AMD kind of went like this. They took all 3 of their potential SKUs and they just tested them for a certain core voltage or perhaps power limit, and said, okay, these ones can perform at these clocks with that arbitrary limit we've set, and these ones can't. So we're going to put these ones in the low bin, and if people want to pump more juice through them and get that kind of performance out of them, they're more than welcome to, but these are the ones that are guaranteed to do so at whatever fucking voltage, 1.22 or whatever the hell it's being reported at. So you buy the 1800X and the 1700X if you don't want to fuddle too much, but if you're an overclocker you have a lot of experience with this shit and you want to save a bunch of money, it seems like the 1700 is a fantastic buy. Just from what I've seen so far, we don't have any scientific data. Nobody's taken multiple samples and tried to squeeze the fuck out of them to see if they can come up with an average. Nobody ever will, for the record. I don't care how many reviewers out there do testing. The controls do not exist to come up with truly scientific data that can back up this claim. We will only ever have anecdotal evidence, but it seems like a fairly safe bet that the binning that took place between these 3 SKUs is not related to overclockability, but more so looks like power limitations and having a certain arbitrary cutoff. Memory. This is bad news all around. It seems right out of the box that memory support is not good. Many reviewers, if not all of them, whether it be on their fucking YouTube videos or their articles that they wrote up, they are all reporting problems with memory stability beyond 2066. And for those who did get them beyond 2666, they did so at an incredible cost in terms of their schedule. So a lot of them put aside meeting their review deadlines and including certain games and certain benchmarks in exchange for getting the best possible memory clocks they could. Some got as high as about 2900 or so, but if you're looking to buy a kit of DDR4000 and make use of that with a Ryzen CPU, at least on launch day, not going to happen. BIOS revisions, microcode updates, these things might change the whole picture entirely. Again, those variable at this point. It's AMD. Just like with their GPUs, their driver maturation takes some time. This is a brand new architecture. You never know, but as it is right now, the memory situation is not good. Streaming. This is what I'm going to close with in terms of performance usage. This is the most interesting for me. Now, when I saw the CPU, the reason why I was excited about it and the reason why I still might get it is because I can see myself getting a B350 motherboard with a single graphics card and a Ryzen CPU and getting into streaming pretty heavily. Now, the reason why this is especially good for streaming, not necessarily so much for gaming exclusively, is because when you're streaming, you're sort of just looking to maintain a minimum frame rate with the best possible graphical details. Usually you're talking 60 at 1080p, because you're not going to stream, your output's not going to be greater than 1080p, that's for sure. But you need those extra cores to smooth everything out. Obviously, if you've streamed before and you tried to do it with anything that's not an i7 on the consumer side that has 4 cores and 8 threads, it's a very painful experience for any game that requires anything more than minimal CPU resources. But with an 8-core, 16-thread CPU, that gives you reasonable single-threaded performance to drive the game and then devote the rest to resources needed elsewhere through OBS and streaming. That is an interesting prospect. However, we do not have any benchmarks of any significance for streaming yet. No one seems to want to test it. And that is where I think Ryzen is going to clean the fuck up. Maybe not the greatest in gaming, but like I said, if you're looking to obtain just a minimum level of performance to output with your stream, you're aiming for that 1080 at 60, and those extra frame rates over and above the 60 frames per second don't really matter because the people out watching it in your stream ain't going to see it. That's where this CPU SKU lineup could shine. So I'm interested to see what happens there. And in fact, if I do decide to buy an R7 1700, which is the CPU I would be targeting, again, like I said, with a B350 motherboard, seems like a pretty good value, I will indeed be testing that and seeing just what kind of an impact this has on streaming over something comparable. So it's hard to say without seeing the 6-core offerings, which for the record are just 8-core CPUs with 2 cores disabled, 1 on each CCX apparently. And the quad-core offerings we haven't seen yet. But given the fact that the overclocking limiter does not necessarily seem to be core count, but something else, I don't know if it's looking quite as rosy as it once was. But all of this considered, you have to remember you're looking at price points that are considerably lower. So still, this is a market-changing release. There's no doubt about that. Strict exclusive gamers are definitely not going to be pleased with what they see today, but enthusiasts, technicians, engineers, developers, everybody going forward is obviously very happy that AMD is pushing the core count forward, and it looks like Intel, at the very least, they might still drag behind a bit, but I'm pretty sure that their consumer lineup at some point, whether it be 9th generation or maybe even 10th generation, will eventually jump up at least a couple cores to try and match. Once again, thanks for watching, guys. I hope this was relatively informative. We'll see you over the weekend probably. I got a keyboard review coming that should be fun, and maybe I'll put up 2 videos this week. Maybe we'll do some more streaming. Thanks again. Thanks for watching. Subscribe, like, follow. Fuck. Goodbye.